I never told my mother-in-law. I used to be a federal prosecutor. She laughed when I walked into court alone. You are finished, she sneered, until the judge said, "Good morning, counselor." My mother-in-law froze. Wait, what? Before I share how a lavish birthday party turned into my ultimate crime scene, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled a corrupt family piece by piece. The heavy oak doors of the elite Atlanta Country Club swung open, and I stepped into the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the 60 tables draped in expensive white linen. Tonight was my mother-in-law Brenda's 60th birthday celebration. The room was packed with the most influential members of her church congregation, all dressed in designer evening wear. I walked toward the main family table holding a carefully wrapped gift box containing a vintage watch I had spent months searching for. I had taken a rare day off from my demanding job at a local nonprofit organization just to ensure everything was perfectly arranged for her big day. Brenda stood at the head of the long table wearing a shimmering gold dress that caught every light in the room. When she saw me approaching, her practiced smile instantly vanished. She snatched the gift box from my hands without a single word of thanks. She held it up by the silk ribbon, inspecting the modest wrapping with clear disdain before dropping it carelessly onto a nearby empty chair. "I suppose this is the absolute best you can do on a non-profit paperwork salary," Brenda announced. Her voice was incredibly loud, purposely designed to carry across the expansive room. Several church elders at the adjacent tables stopped their conversations and turned to look at us. "It is truly a shame you gave up a real career to push papers all day. But then again, you never did have the ambition required to match the status of this family." I felt a familiar sting of humiliation, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I looked past Brenda and caught the eye of my husband Andre. He was sitting next to his sister and her husband wearing a custom tuxedo I had bought him for our 5th anniversary. I waited for him to stand up and defend me, just as he had promised he always would when we exchanged our wedding vows. Andre stood up, but he did not walk toward me. Instead, he reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He tossed them onto the banquet table right next to my discarded gift. "Those are divorce papers," Vivian Andre said. His voice lacked any trace of warmth or emotion. "Sign them tonight." The ballroom grew deathly quiet. The gentle clinking of fine silverware stopped completely. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process the sudden brutal betrayal. Andre adjusted his cuffs and looked me dead in the eye. "My mistress is pregnant," he stated casually, as if discussing the weather forecast. "She is carrying my firstborn son, a real heir. I want you out of my house by midnight." My breath caught painfully in my throat. We had spent the last 3 years enduring agonizing medical treatments, trying desperately to start a family. I had intentionally stepped back from my intense legal career to focus entirely on my physical health and our future children. And now he was standing in front of his entire family and their prominent church congregation, throwing my deepest sacrifices right back in my face. Before I could even form a response, Brenda stepped right into my personal space. She snatched the glass of sparkling water I was holding and slammed it down onto the table. Water splashed aggressively across the pristine white tablecloth. "Do not look so shocked," Vivian Brenda sneered. "I picked the girl out myself. She comes from a highly respected pastoral family. She understands what it takes to uphold a legacy. She is young, vibrant, and most importantly, she is not a barren parasite like you." The words hit me like physical blows. Barren parasite. She was weaponizing my deepest pain for a public spectacle. "You took a low-paying desk job because you claimed you needed less stress to get pregnant," Brenda continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You sat in my $2 million mansion for years, eating our food, spending my son's hard-earned money, and you could not even perform the basic duty of a wife. You failed. You are a complete failure as a woman, and you are a failure to this family. Pack your cheap bags and get out of our lives." I felt the eyes of 50 strangers burning into my skin. They were waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg, to fall to my knees, and plead for a second chance. But I did not shed a single tear. The initial shock was rapidly being replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. "You seem to be forgetting one crucial detail, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "That $2 million mansion is legally mine. My name is the only one on the deed. I paid the heavy down payment before I even met your son. If anyone is leaving tonight, it will be Andre." A harsh, mocking laugh echoed from the other side of the table. Garrett, Andre's white brother-in-law, stepped forward. He was married to Andre's sister, and he had always carried himself with an unbearable sense of superiority. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down at me with an arrogant smirk. "You really are as naive as you look," Vivian Garrett chuckled. He reached into his own leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper stamped with a shiny notary seal. He waved it in front of my face like a winning lottery ticket. "As the official real estate broker for this family, I handle all the important property transactions," Garrett boasted. "You signed a general power of attorney document when we refinanced the mortgage last year. Did you really think I would not use it to protect my family's assets? I legally transferred the deed of that house into Brenda's private trust fund last month. You own absolutely nothing. You are completely broke and you are officially homeless." Garrett crossed his arms, his chest puffed out in triumph. Andre smiled, looking entirely relieved that his brother-in-law had handled the dirty work. Brenda practically glowed with satisfaction, looking around the room to ensure everyone had witnessed her absolute victory over me. They had colluded. They had plotted behind my back, using my trust against me, orchestrating my financial and emotional ruin right down to the exact day. I looked at the forged document in Garrett's hand. I looked at Brenda's triumphant smile. I looked at the man I had loved for 5 years, who was now discarding me for a younger woman his mother had hired. They expected a hysterical reaction. They desperately wanted a dramatic show. Instead, I reached over and calmly picked up my purse. I smoothed the lapels of my simple black blazer. I looked Garrett straight in the eyes, then shifted my piercing gaze to Andre and Brenda. "You just made the most fatal mistake of your entire lives," I said softly, ensuring only the 4 of us could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "Enjoy the cake." I turned on my heel and walked out of the grand ballroom, the heavy oak doors closing firmly behind me. I did not look back. I did not need to. They thought they had just ruined a defenseless nonprofit worker. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a woman who knew exactly how to bury them all. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing away the murmurs of the stunned country club crowd. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face, but it felt bracing rather than oppressive. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply adjusted the strap of my purse and walked toward the valet stand where my black sedan sat idling under the portico. The sharp strike of my heels against the pavement was the only sound in the quiet night until the heavy doors banged open again. "Vivian, wait." Andre called out, his voice echoing across the circular driveway, stripped of the arrogant bravado he had just displayed in front of his mother and her church elders. I kept walking. I reached the driver's side door and my hand grazed the cool metal handle. Andre closed the distance between us, breathing heavily, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking less like armor and more like a cheap costume. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. "Give me the keys, Vivian." His tone shifted back to entitlement. "You heard what Garrett said. The house is in my mother's trust. The assets are protected. You are not taking the car. This car was paid for with my company money." I looked down at his hand gripping my wrist. I did not pull away. I just stared at his fingers until the uncomfortable silence forced him to let go. I pressed the lock button on my key fob. The car chirped twice and the mirrors folded inward. "Your company money?" I repeated the words slowly, tasting the absolute delusion in his statement. "You mean the company credit line I co-signed? The credit line secured by my pristine financial history because your credit score was destroyed before we even met." Andre puffed out his chest, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "It does not matter whose name was on the initial application, Vivian. I am the CEO. I run the accounts. Now hand over the keys before I call security and have them remove you from the premises for making a scene." I smiled. It was a small, tight smile that made the blood drain from his face. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen twice. "I am not giving you the keys, Andre," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "And you are not calling security. In fact, you will not be calling anyone or paying for anything tonight. I canceled your authorized user access on the corporate black card exactly 5 minutes ago while you were busy showing off for your mother. I also canceled the platinum card you use for your little overseas vacations. I canceled the gas card. I canceled the dining card." Andre stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You wanted me out of the house by midnight," I continued, leaning closer to him. "I am leaving right now. But you are going to have to find another way to pay for your mistress and her unborn child, because your free ride is officially over." I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving him standing under the portico with empty pockets and a crumbling ego. I drove straight to a luxury downtown hotel, checking into a corner suite, using a private account they knew nothing about. I slept perfectly. I slept deeply. I slept like a woman who had just shed 200 pounds of dead weight. The next morning, I woke up at dawn. I put on a tailored charcoal gray suit, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and drove to the nonprofit organization where I worked. The office was quiet when I arrived, but the tension in the air was thick. I knew exactly what was coming. By 9 in the morning, my desk phone rang. It was the executive director, Mr. Sterling, requesting my presence in his office immediately. I walked down the hall, my posture straight. When I entered his office, Mr. Sterling looked incredibly uncomfortable. He was an older man who had dedicated his life to community service, and he hated conflict. "Vivian, please sit down." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. He rubbed his temples, looking at the telephone receiver as if it had physically burned him. "I just received a very disturbing phone call from Brenda." I sat down and crossed my legs. "What did my mother-in-law say, Mr. Sterling?" He sighed heavily. "She claimed you stole money from her son. She claimed you are unstable and dangerous. She demanded that I terminate your employment immediately, or she will ensure her church congregation withdraws all their annual funding from our community programs. You know her church provides nearly 30% of our operating budget, Vivian. She threatened to ruin our entire organization if you remain on staff." I looked at the framed photos of community projects on his wall. I knew Brenda would sink this low. I knew she would try to cut off my only visible source of income to force me into submission. She wanted me desperate. She wanted me crawling back to beg for mercy. "I am very sorry she put you in this position," I said calmly. Mr. Sterling shook his head and opened his desk drawer. "Do not apologize, Vivian. When you asked me for a quiet job here 3 years ago, you told me you needed a break from the pressure of your old life. I respected your privacy, but I also knew exactly who you were before you came to us. I know you did not steal anything from anyone." He pulled out a thick manila folder wrapped in a red security band and slid it across the desk toward me. "You asked me last week to discreetly gather all the vendor contracts and charitable donation records linking our organization to Garrett's real estate firm and Brenda's church fund," he explained, keeping his voice low. "I stayed late every night this week compiling the data. I did not ask questions then, and I will not ask questions now. But looking at these numbers, I think you are about to do something very necessary." I took the folder. The weight of it felt solid and reassuring in my hands. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I suggest you hold off on returning Brenda's call. By tomorrow morning, her threat to pull funding will be the least of her concerns." I walked back to my desk and opened the file. The pages were filled with financial discrepancies, inflated invoices, and phantom property deeds. I read the first page. I read the second page. I read the third page. Every single line confirmed what I already knew. Garrett had been using Brenda's church charity to funnel money into his own pockets, and he had been using my husband's company as a tax shelter. The arrogance was staggering. The stupidity was even worse. My cell phone began to vibrate on the desk. The caller ID flashed Andres' name. I let it ring. It stopped and then immediately started ringing again. He called 4 times in a row before I finally swiped the screen and answered. "Vivian." Andre was screaming so loudly the audio distorted. "What did you do? What the hell did you do? I leaned back in my chair, flipping through a bank statement showing Garrett's offshore transfers. What seems to be the problem, Andre? Do not play games with me, he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. My corporate accounts are frozen. The bank says there is a hold on all outgoing transfers. The payroll checks are bouncing. My suppliers are threatening to cancel shipments. You have to fix this right now, or I swear to God I will ruin you. Through the phone, I could hear Brenda screaming in the background. Her voice was shrill and frantic. Tell that barren thief I am calling the police. Tell her she is finished. Tell her I will see her in handcuffs before sunset. She stole your money. I am calling the cops. I listened to their panic. I listened to their fear. I listened to the sound of their carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around them. Are you calling the police, Andre? I asked, my voice smooth and untroubled. My mother is dialing 911 right now, you crazy woman! Andre threatened, breathing heavily into the receiver. You are going to jail. I smiled, looking down at the red security band on the file folder. Good, I replied. Please tell Brenda to hurry up. I am sitting right here at my desk, and I am patiently waiting for the cops to arrive. We have a lot of paperwork to discuss. Less than 10 minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon air outside my office window. Heavy boots echoed down the hallway of the nonprofit center. My office door was thrown open, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Right behind them was Brenda. She had managed to squeeze out genuine tears, ruining her expensive mascara. She clutched a lace handkerchief to her chest and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. That is her officer, Brenda cried out, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured terror. That is the woman who stole from my son. She hijacked his corporate accounts and is trying to ruin our family business. Please, you have to arrest her before she drains everything we have left. The taller of the two officers stepped forward, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. Mom, please stand up and place your hands behind your back, he ordered sternly. I remained seated in my chair, folding my hands neatly on top of my desk. I looked at the officer and asked him in a calm voice if he possessed a signed warrant for my arrest. He frowned, clearly annoyed that a woman working at a small community center was questioning his authority. We have a credible witness reporting grand larceny and wire fraud, he stated, tapping his radio. We have probable cause to detain you for questioning regarding the theft of corporate funds. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were bypassing standard procedure because Brenda was a prominent figure in the community and played the wealthy victim flawlessly. I could have shut it down right then. I could have made one phone call and had both officers disciplined. But I needed Brenda to fully commit to her false report. I needed her lies officially logged into the police record. I stood up slowly and offered my wrists. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around my skin. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sob of relief, leaning heavily against the doorframe as if the ordeal had drained her life force. As the officers marched me past her, she leaned in close and whispered so only I could hear. I told you that you were finished, you barren trash. The ride to the precinct was silent. I was processed and placed in a stark gray interrogation room. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat in the metal chair bolted to the floor, staring straight ahead at the large two-way mirror on the opposite wall. I knew Brenda was standing on the other side of that glass, eagerly waiting to watch my complete humiliation. After 20 minutes, the door opened and two detectives walked in. They tossed a thick file onto the metal table and sat across from me. They looked tired and aggressive, entirely convinced they were dealing with a bitter broke ex-wife trying to extort her wealthy husband. Your mother-in-law filed a very detailed sworn statement, Vivian, the lead detective said, leaning forward aggressively. She provided bank records showing you initiated unauthorized freezes on corporate accounts that do not belong to you. That is a federal offense. You are looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in prison. You made a massive mistake trying to steal from people with deep pockets. If you confess right now and unlock the accounts, we might be able to talk the prosecutor down to a lesser charge. I let him finish his entire speech. I looked at the printed statement Brenda had signed, which was laying open on the table. Then I leaned forward and looked the detective directly in the eyes. "Detective," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. Section 16(9) of the State Penal Code clearly defines theft as the unlawful taking of property belonging to another. However, if you actually read those bank records, instead of just taking the word of a crying woman in a designer dress, you would see that my name is the primary guarantor on that corporate credit line. The detective blinked, looking down at the papers. I continued without missing a beat. "Since my pristine credit score secured those accounts, and I am legally married to Andre, in a state that recognizes joint marital assets, placing a freeze on a credit line to prevent financial dissipation during a pending divorce is a civil domestic matter. It is not a criminal act. Furthermore, Brenda just signed a sworn statement claiming she has direct knowledge and management over my husband's corporate accounts. That is fascinating, considering her name is not legally attached to his business in any capacity. By admitting she has access to those funds, she just confessed in a sworn police document to unauthorized use of a commercial credit profile." The second detective frowned and pulled the file closer to him, scanning the pages. I kept speaking, my tone shifting to the sharp, authoritative cadence I had perfected over a decade. "You arrested me without a warrant based on a civil financial dispute because you failed to verify the primary account holder. You are currently holding me under the false pretense of grand larceny, which violates my civil rights and exposes your department to a massive federal lawsuit for false imprisonment. I suggest you read the primary guarantor line on page 4 of that banking document before you threaten me with prison time again." The detectives exchanged a nervous glance. The lead detective opened his mouth to argue back, but the heavy metal door of the interrogation room suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. The precinct captain, a veteran officer with silver hair and a stern face, stormed into the room. He looked at the two detectives sitting at the table, and then his eyes landed on me, sitting in the interrogation chair. The color instantly drained from the captain's face. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in pure terror. He knew exactly who I was. He had sat in federal courtrooms and watched me tear international crime syndicates to shreds. He immediately snapped to attention, his posture going completely rigid. He ignored his confused detectives and offered me a sharp, respectful salute. "Good morning, counselor," he said, his voice actually trembling. "I am so incredibly sorry for this catastrophic misunderstanding." I smiled and glanced at the two-way mirror. I knew Brenda was standing right behind that glass. I knew she had just watched the highest-ranking police officer in the building snap to attention and salute the woman she had called a useless parasite. I could easily imagine her smug smile dropping into absolute horrified shock. "Good morning, Captain," I replied calmly, adjusting the handcuffs on my wrists. "I believe your officers and I have a lot of false police reports to discuss." The captain stood frozen for a second before he barked an order at the two detectives to remove the handcuffs immediately. The heavy metal fell away from my wrists with a dull clatter against the table. The lead detective looked completely bewildered, but the captain gave him no chance to speak. He pulled out a chair for me, offering a profound apology, wiping sweat from his forehead. He explained to his subordinates exactly who they had just arrested, and the color drained from their faces too. I rubbed my wrists and smiled at the terrified men in the room. I told the captain I did not blame his detectives for doing their jobs, but I insisted they preserve every single piece of documentation from this morning. I wanted Brenda's false statement filed, stamped, and permanently entered into the public record. Filing a false police report to orchestrate an unlawful arrest was a severe crime, and I needed her perjury secured for my upcoming federal case. The captain assured me everything would be handled. Precisely by the book, he personally escorted me out of the precinct, walking past the front desk, where Brenda was still waiting. Her smug expression vanished the moment she saw the captain holding the door open for me, offering his personal card, and apologizing one last time. I did not even glance in her direction as I walked out into the crisp Atlanta morning. I returned to my secure office at the non-profit center and locked the door. Mr. Sterling had given me the vendor files, but I needed to dig deeper into the financial rot infecting this family. I booted up my encrypted terminal and bypassed the standard firewalls, using the highest level of federal clearance. I still maintained. My crosshairs were locked firmly on Garrett. The arrogant white brother-in-law thought he could waltz into my life and steal my home with a forged power of attorney. He thought his expensive suits and real estate broker license made him untouchable. I pulled up his personal credit network, mapping out every financial footprint he had left over the past 5 years. What I found was a sprawling web of toxic debt and financial desperation. Garrett was not a successful businessman. He was completely broke. His commercial properties were leveraged to the absolute maximum, and his credit score was barely hanging on through a series of complex shell companies he had been moving money from one failing project to another in a desperate attempt to keep his house of cards from collapsing. I downloaded every bank statement, hidden account, and fraudulent loan application he had submitted. My desk phone began to ring, and I saw LaToya's name flashing on the caller ID. LaToya was Andre's sister and Garrett's wife. She had always despised me, viewing my career and independence as a direct threat to her deeply ingrained insecurities. I answered the call and pulled the receiver away from my ear as her shrill voice echoed through the small office. She was screaming about how I was destroying her family, she yelled. That the police called Brenda about the false report, and now the local investors were getting nervous. She blamed me for the fact that Garrett's phone was ringing off the hook with panicked creditors. She called me a bitter, vindictive woman, trying to ruin the only successful white man who had ever graced their family. She boasted about how Garrett was a brilliant broker who was going to ensure I ended up with absolutely nothing. I let her scream until she had to pause for breath. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional reaction to her venom. Instead, I highlighted a specific PDF document on my screen. It was a hidden bank statement I had just unearthed from Garrett's offshore network. The document showed a massive line of credit taken out against LaToya's personal inheritance trust. Garrett had drained her accounts dry to cover his failing business ventures, and he had used the remaining funds to sign a long-term lease on a luxury penthouse in downtown Atlanta under the name of a 22-year-old fitness instructor. I attached the file to an encrypted email and sent it to LaToya's personal address. I told LaToya to check her inbox. I told her before she called my office to defend her. Brilliant husband, she might want to look at where her inheritance had actually gone over the past 6 months. I listened as she clicked open the email. The aggressive breathing on the other end of the line stopped completely. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I told her to pay special attention to the penthouse lease on page 3 and the zero balance on her trust fund on page 4. LaToya let out a choked sound that was half gasp and half sob. Before the line went completely dead, I placed the receiver back on the base and turned my attention back to the primary financial flow I needed to know how Garrett was keeping his business afloat, if his personal funds were completely drained. I traced the incoming wire transfers to his primary shell company. A distinct pattern emerged, showing large sums of cash being deposited on the first of every month. I ran the routing numbers through the federal database and cross-referenced them with the documents Mr. Sterling had provided. The results made my blood run cold. The routing numbers did not belong to private investors or legitimate business partners. They matched the exact banking details of the Sanctuary Charity Fund. Garrett was using the sacred donations from Brenda's church congregation to launder money for his phantom real estate projects. Given the strict financial controls on that specific account, there was absolutely no way he could be doing it without Brenda's direct authorization and active participation. The mother-in-law who paraded her faith around like a weapon was robbing her own community blind. I did not waste a single second celebrating my discovery of Brenda and Garrett's money laundering operation. I had one more loose end to tie up before I brought the entire corrupt structure crashing down around them. I picked up my phone and sent a brief text message to the number I had extracted from Andre's billing records. I suggested a meeting at an upscale coffee shop in Buckhead. I knew she would not be able to resist the opportunity to gloat. I arrived 10 minutes early and ordered a simple black tea, taking a seat at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. She walked in exactly on time, carrying a designer handbag that I recognized immediately because I had paid the credit card bill for it just last month. She was young, exactly as Brenda had boasted, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of unbearable entitlement. She spotted me and walked over, sliding into the chair across from me with a heavy, dramatic sigh, as if my very presence was exhausting. She did not bother to introduce herself. Instead, she immediately placed her left hand on the table, ensuring the large diamond engagement ring caught the ambient light of the cafe. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, looking at me with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Andre told me you were stubborn," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "He said you would not sign the divorce papers without making a huge, desperate scene. I just want you to know that I am not angry with you, Vivian. I understand how hard it must be to lose everything because you simply could not fulfill your basic duties as a woman. Andre needs a real family and a wife who can actually give him a healthy heir. My family has always taught me the importance of supporting a successful man. You should just walk away quietly and let us be happy in our beautiful new home." I let her finish her rehearsed pastoral speech. I looked at the shiny diamond ring, and then I looked directly into her naive eyes. I did not show a single ounce of anger or hurt. I slowly unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of verified financial documents, placing them gently on the wooden table between us. "You are from a highly respected religious family," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. "You must value absolute honesty and strict financial integrity. So I think you should know exactly what kind of success you are marrying into." I tapped the top document with my index finger, pushing it toward her. "Andre told you that the $2 million mansion in Buckhead was his property. He told you that he was transferring the deed into your name as a lavish wedding gift to secure your future and the future of your baby." Her smug smile faltered slightly. She crossed her arms, defensive now. "It is his house," she snapped. "He is the CEO of his own company. He is putting my name on the deed next week as soon as he kicks you out on the street." I slid the paper closer so she was forced to read the bold print at the top of the page. "I suggest you read the fine print before you sign anything," I advised her smoothly. "That house does not belong to Andre. It belonged to me until Garrett fraudulently transferred it into Brenda's private trust fund. But what neither Garrett nor Andre bothered to tell you is that the property has a massive hidden balloon mortgage attached to it. They took out 3 separate aggressive loans against the equity to fund Andre's failing business ventures. The house is currently 90 days past due on payments. It is completely underwater." She stared at the bank statements, her eyes darting across the highlighted negative balances and the bright red foreclosure warnings. The color began to rapidly drain from her cheeks as the reality of the numbers set in. "If Andre transfers that deed into your name," I explained using the sharp, precise tone I used to dismantle hostile witnesses on the stand, "you will legally absorb millions of dollars in toxic debt. The bank is preparing to seize the asset next month. By accepting that house, you are guaranteeing your own absolute financial ruin. Your credit will be completely destroyed. Your pastoral family will be dragged into a massive public bankruptcy scandal. Andre is not giving you a home to raise his heir. He is using you as a human shield to escape his own crushing debt before the federal auditors arrive." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The arrogant girl who had walked in flashing a diamond ring was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified young woman realizing she was about to be left holding the bag for a family of ruthless con artists. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, Andre loves me. He would not do that to me. He said he was protecting me from your greed and your jealousy." I leaned back in my chair and gestured toward her purse. "Call him," I challenged softly. "Call him right now and tell him you want to see the mortgage statements before you sign the deed transfer. Tell him your father wants his personal accountant to review the paperwork to ensure your baby is protected. See exactly what he says to you." Panic completely overtook her. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she pulled her phone from her designer bag and hit speed dial. I silently pressed the record button on my own phone, resting face up on the table. Andre answered on the second ring, his voice booming loudly through the phone speaker. baby. I told you I am busy handling the lawyers," he complained, sounding irritated and stressed. She did not hesitate. "Andre, is there a balloon mortgage on the house?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing in the quiet cafe. "Are you trying to transfer $2 million of toxic debt into my name to save yourself?" There was a dead, sickening silence on the other end of the line. When Andre finally spoke, his voice was frantic and vicious, proving exactly who he was behind the charming facade. "Who told you that?" he screamed through the speaker. "You just signed the papers like we agreed. I need that debt off my books before the company goes under completely. Do not ask stupid questions, and just sign the damn deed so I can save my accounts before the bank comes after me." I smiled a genuine smile of victory as I stopped the recording on my phone. The mistress stared at her screen in absolute horror, realizing her perfect future was a devastating financial trap. I reached over and tapped my phone screen, saving the audio file to my secure cloud server. I now had the hard, irrefutable evidence of Andres' deliberate scheme to commit financial fraud and ruin a naive girl just to save himself. I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving the weeping girl to deal with the wreckage of her own poor choices. The afternoon sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds as I crossed the busy downtown street toward the municipal parking garage. My heels echoed loudly on the concrete ramps as I made my way up to the third level where I had parked my car earlier that morning. The garage was mostly empty at this hour. The heavy concrete pillars cast long, dark shadows across the designated parking spots, and the air smelled faintly of motor oil and damp cement. I reached into my purse and pulled out my keys. Before I could press the unlock button, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar, directly blocking my path to the driver's side door. It was Garrett. He was wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit, but his silk tie was pulled loose, and his face was flushed bright red with raw anger. He looked down at me with the exact same unbearable arrogance he had displayed at the birthday party, but there was a frantic, sharp edge of absolute desperation in his eyes now. "You have been a very busy woman, Vivian," he said, his voice echoing aggressively in the empty concrete structure. He took a heavy step forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical height and broad shoulders to intimidate me into backing away. "My wife has been crying all morning. My phone has not stopped ringing with calls from angry investors. You are sticking your nose into complex business structures you could not possibly comprehend." I stood my ground, refusing to give him even a single inch of space. I looked at his expensive Italian leather shoes, and then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his furious eyes. "I comprehend fraud perfectly, Garrett," I replied, keeping my voice completely level and unbothered. "I comprehend offshore accounts and phantom real estate deeds. I comprehend that you have bankrupted your own wife and are currently sinking Andre's company to cover your toxic tracks." Garrett let out a loud, harsh laugh that sounded more like a bark. He took another aggressive step forward, stepping into my shadow and trapping me between his large body and the side of my car. "You really think you are smart?" he sneered, looking down at me as if I were something disgusting he had scraped off his shoe. "You are just a bitter ex-wife working a low-paying desk job for a pathetic community center. You are completely out of your league here, Vivian. You actually think you can take me down. I have a legal team on retainer that costs more than you will make in your entire lifetime. They are aggressive, and they are incredibly expensive, and they are entirely composed of powerful white men who will absolutely crush a woman like you in court. They will drag your name through the mud and bury you in so much litigation you will never see the light of day." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slammed it down against the roof of my car and pulled a heavy gold pen from his shirt pocket. He shoved the pen directly toward my chest. "This is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a full waiver of liability," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You are going to sign this right now. You are going to drop whatever pathetic little investigation you think you are conducting into my firm and the church charity fund. You will sign this and you will walk away quietly. If you do this, I might convince Andre to give you a small alimony settlement to keep you from starving on the streets." I looked at the heavy gold pen in his hand and then looked at his flushed, angry face. You seem very eager to protect that church charity fund, Garrett, I said softly, letting a hint of genuine curiosity enter my voice. Why is the wealthy, successful real estate broker so desperately worried about a simple community nonprofit account? His face twisted with an ugly mixture of bruised pride and racial superiority. He could not resist the urge to brag about his own perceived genius. Because it is the easiest money I have ever made in my entire life, he spat out, losing whatever professional filter he normally maintained. Brenda practically hands me the keys to the vault. Her entire congregation is so incredibly naive and so eager to trust the successful white son-in-law who promises to invest in their urban neighborhoods. They empty their pockets every Sunday thinking they are funding community centers and affordable housing projects. They are so desperate for a savior, they never even ask to see the property deeds or the financial returns. I take their weekly donations and I funnel the cash right into my own development projects to cover my failing margins. I have been bleeding them dry for 4 years and no one has ever dared to question me. I am the financial brains of this entire family, Vivian. I own them all. Now sign the paper before I lose my temper. He tapped the gold pen aggressively against the metal roof of my car. He was panting slightly, his chest heaving with the thrill of his own arrogant confession. He truly believed he was completely untouchable. He believed his skin color, his gender, and his expensive suits made him invincible against a woman like me. I did not take the pen. I did not look at the paper. I simply smoothed the lapel of my black blazer and offered him a warm, genuine smile. Garrett, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational and almost friendly tone. When you decided to ambush a woman today, you really should have paid much more attention to where I parked my car. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. He stopped tapping the pen and glanced nervously around the empty concrete garage. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its bravado. You see, Garrett, I currently work for a community nonprofit organization, I explained slowly, ensuring his panicked brain absorbed every single word. But before I took that quiet desk job, I spent 10 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in organized crime and corporate financial fraud. And because of my previous federal clearance, I still retain access to certain secured parking facilities in the downtown district. Facilities exactly like this one. I raised my right hand and pointed a single manicured finger directly upward. Garrett slowly turned his head and followed my gaze. Mounted on the concrete ceiling directly above the hood of my car was a heavy black glass dome. This is a federal courthouse overflow parking structure, I informed him, watching the color completely drain from his arrogant face until he was as pale as a ghost. That black dome houses a high-definition federal security camera equipped with a highly sensitive parabolic microphone designed to record conversations in open spaces. It is monitored 24 hours a day by federal agents. You just cornered a former federal prosecutor and threatened her with physical intimidation. You just attempted to extort a signature on a legal document. And most importantly, you just confessed in stunning detail to wire fraud, money laundering, and the systemic financial exploitation of a registered religious charity on a continuous federal recording. Garrett stumbled backward, his feet tangling together until his shoulders slammed hard against the concrete pillar. The heavy gold pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the dirty floor. His mouth opened wide, but he could not draw enough air into his lungs to form a single word. You do not need an expensive legal team, Garrett, I whispered, stepping toward him as he cowered against the pillar. You need a miracle. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary stood tall against the bright Sunday morning sun. I wore a pristine white suit that mirrored the absolute clarity of my intentions. This was not just any church. It was a sprawling megachurch in the heart of Atlanta, a monument to wealth and status built on the backs of thousands of trusting congregants. It was also the center of Brenda's entire social universe. I stepped into the massive foyer, listening to the booming sounds of the gospel choir filtering through the main doors. I walked past the greeting deacons who stared at me with wide eyes. I pushed open the double doors to the main sanctuary and stepped into the plush carpeted aisle. The room was packed with over 3,000 people. Up on the grand stage, bathed in theatrical lighting, stood Brenda. She was wearing a shimmering purple robe, her arms waving dramatically as she directed the massive choir. She looked like a queen ruling over her devoted subjects. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her brilliant son-in-law Garrett was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. I walked slowly down the center aisle. The rhythmic clapping and singing covered the sound of my footsteps, but the congregation began to notice my presence. Heads turned, and whispers spread through the pews like a wave. I did not stop until I reached the very front row, a section strictly reserved for the Board of Elders and the highest tier of financial donors. I calmly took an empty seat right in the center, perfectly aligning myself with Brenda's line of sight. Brenda turned her head to signal the sopranos, and her eyes locked onto me. Her hands froze in mid-air. The choir stumbled, missing a beat as their director suddenly lost all rhythm. Brenda's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She recovered quickly, flashing a fake smile to the congregation while making a sharp, discreet hand signal to the head usher standing by the altar steps. I knew exactly what that signal meant. She was ordering him to remove the trash. Two large men in immaculate dark suits marched down the aisle toward me. Their faces were set in grim lines of authority. They flanked my row, and the taller one leaned in, gesturing for me to stand up and follow him outside. I did not resist. I did not cause a scene. I simply stood up and smoothed the front of my white blazer. But before I stepped out of the row, I held up a single finger, signaling for a moment of patience. It was exactly time for the morning offering. The financial deacons were moving down the rows holding digital collection scanners and polished brass plates. It was a highly efficient modern system designed to process massive donations in real time directly to the Sanctuary Charity Fund. The deacon assigned to the front row stepped up to me holding out the digital scanner. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cashier's check. It was not a normal check. It was a specially coded draft I had prepared using Garrett's laundered routing numbers, directly connecting the Sanctuary Fund to his offshore shell companies. I dropped the heavy paper check onto the scanning tray. The deacon tapped the screen to process the donation. I watched Brenda out of the corner of my eye. She was gripping her podium, her knuckles white, waiting for the ushers to drag me away so she could resume her performance. The moment the scanner processed the routing numbers, the church's electronic banking system reacted. It was programmed to instantly verify large transactions, but my check carried a federal flag. By attempting to process a transaction linked to a federally frozen offshore account, the church's entire financial network was instantly pulled into the lockdown protocol. A loud, shrill alarm suddenly erupted from the deacon's tablet. It was not just his device. Every financial scanner in the hands of every usher across the enormous sanctuary began flashing bright red and emitting the same piercing error tone. The church's main production screens, which had been displaying uplifting Bible verses, suddenly flickered and went black before flashing a massive red banking alert indicating a total system freeze. The choir stopped singing completely. The congregation gasped in collective confusion. The two ushers beside me forgot their orders to escort me out and stared at the screens in panic. Up on the stage, Brenda looked like she had seen a ghost. Her purple robe suddenly seemed too big for her shrinking frame. She frantically waved at the sound technicians to cut the alarms, but the automated system was locked by the bank. The head of the Board of Elders, an imposing man named Pastor Thomas, stood up from his seat in the front row. He was holding his personal administrative tablet, staring at the screen with absolute horror. He looked from his screen to the main displays, and then his furious gaze locked onto Brenda. The sanctuary was deathly quiet except for the fading echoes of the digital alarms. Pastor Thomas gripped his tablet so hard his hands shook. He stepped up to the edge of the stage, and his voice boomed through his lapel microphone, filling the massive room with terrifying clarity. Brenda, he demanded, his tone stripped of all pastoral warmth. The bank has just locked our entire operating system. I am looking at a federal alert showing massive unauthorized transfers from the Sanctuary Charity Fund to private real estate accounts. Millions of dollars of our congregation's money is missing. Brenda gripped her chest, her mouth opening and closing in silent panic. She looked at Pastor Thomas, and then she looked down at me standing calmly in the front row. The congregation erupted into a deafening roar of outrage and betrayal. The people she had exploited were finally waking up to the truth. I simply picked up my purse, turned around, and began walking back up the center aisle, leaving Brenda to face the wrath of 3,000 betrayed believers. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary into the bright Atlanta sunshine, leaving the chaotic roar of the betrayed congregation behind me. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean after breathing in the toxic atmosphere of Brenda's absolute hypocrisy for so long. I walked to my car with slow, deliberate steps, knowing that the first massive domino had officially fallen. But I also knew that people like Brenda Garrett and Andre did not simply surrender when they were cornered. They were predators who had grown fat on the blind trust of others, and now that their primary food supply was threatened, they would lash out with everything they had. I knew they would inevitably band together to fight me. The cheating husband, the fraudulent brother-in-law, and the corrupt mother-in-law formed a desperate, unholy trinity. By Tuesday morning, my lingering connections at the federal courthouse informed me that they were finally making their move. They had pooled their remaining liquid assets to hire a notoriously aggressive corporate law firm. They were terrified of the federal alerts I had triggered at the church, and they needed to instantly change the public narrative. They needed a scapegoat to blame for their collapsing empires, and they decided that a massive, crushing civil lawsuit would terrify me into submission and silence. They thought they could use the legal system to bully me into giving up my fight. I did not change my daily routine or hide in my apartment. I knew exactly what was coming, and I was fully prepared to face it. On Wednesday afternoon, I was standing in the bright glass-enclosed lobby of the Community Nonprofit Center, reviewing a grant proposal with our receptionist. The heavy glass front doors suddenly swung open with violent force. A tall man in a sharp charcoal suit marched directly into the lobby, flanked by two younger associates who carried thick leather briefcases. He did not bother stopping at the reception desk or asking for an appointment. He radiated the exact same toxic, unbearable arrogance that Garrett and Andre always displayed. He walked right up to me, invading my personal space, and slammed a thick bound legal folder directly against my chest, forcing me to catch it before it hit the floor. He loudly introduced himself as the senior litigation partner representing my former husband, my brother-in-law, and my mother-in-law. He practically shouted so his voice would echo off the glass walls and ensure everyone in the lobby could hear his intimidation tactics. He announced that his clients were officially filing a $10 million civil lawsuit against me. He listed the charges with a dramatic sneer, claiming malicious defamation, intentional business interference, and severe emotional distress. He laughed a cruel, dismissive sound that was meant to make me feel small and completely powerless. He wanted me to break down and cry right there in the lobby in front of my coworkers. He looked around the modest nonprofit lobby and mocked my quiet life. He told me I was a bitter, jealous woman who simply could not handle being replaced by a younger, more vibrant woman. He stated that I was completely isolated and that my former family was going to bankrupt me into total oblivion. He boasted that his powerful firm would seize my modest bank accounts, garnish my nonprofit salary, and leave me begging on the streets. He said Brenda was a beloved community pillar and that a nobody like me could never destroy her pristine reputation. He claimed Andre was an innocent victim of my vindictive rage and that Garrett was a brilliant businessman whose name I had unfairly dragged through the mud. The two younger associates snickered behind him, clearly enjoying the spectacle of a woman being publicly threatened by wealthy men. He leaned in close and told me that if I dropped my absurd allegations and signed a public retraction, they might let me walk away with a few $1,000s to start my pathetic life over somewhere else. He told me I was outmatched and that I had absolutely no hope of winning against their limitless resources. He commanded me to surrender immediately. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I did not offer the fearful reaction he was so desperately hoping to see. I simply held the heavy legal folder against my chest and slowly opened the thick cover. I bypassed his aggressive demands and read the jurisdiction listed at the very top of the official court filing. A warm, genuine smile slowly spread across my face, completely unnerving the senior partner. His confident smirk faltered as he tried to understand why his intimidation was failing so spectacularly. He looked back at his associates, who suddenly stopped laughing and began to shift nervously on their feet. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek gold pen. I calmly flipped to the back page of the document and signed the official acknowledgement of service with steady, precise strokes. I ripped off the receipt copy and handed it back to the arrogant lawyer. I looked at his confused face and told him he really should have checked his jurisdictional boundaries before filing such an aggressive little lawsuit on behalf of 3 known criminals. I watched his eyes widen as the realization of his massive mistake began to dawn on him. I explained, my voice projecting clearly through the quiet lobby, that by filing these specific financial claims in the Federal District Court of Northern Georgia, they had just legally waived their absolute right to financial privacy. I told him that in order to sue me for $10 million of business interference, his clients would now be legally mandated to prove they ran legitimate business operations. I explained that I had been waiting for them to file in this exact federal jurisdiction for a very long time, because now every single hidden bank account, offshore trust, fraudulent deed, and laundered asset belonging to Brenda, Andre, and Garrett was subject to automatic mandatory federal discovery. They had just willingly handed their entire criminal enterprise over to a federal judge on a silver platter. I smiled as the senior partner snatched the receipt and backed away trembling, realizing he had just signed his own client's federal prison sentences. The deposition took place 2 weeks later in a sterile, overly air-conditioned conference room deep within the federal courthouse. The air felt heavy and stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and impending doom. Brenda, Andre, and Garrett sat on one side of the long mahogany table, looking incredibly smug and entirely too confident for 3 people currently sitting in the crosshairs of a massive federal investigation. Their expensive senior litigation partner, the same arrogant man who had ambushed me in my lobby, sat at the head of the table, surrounded by towering stacks of fabricated evidence and falsified financial reports. He was still seething from our previous encounter, and he was absolutely determined to break me on the official record. I sat entirely alone on the opposite side of the table, with nothing but a simple yellow legal pad, a glass of ice water, and my unshakable composure. A federal court reporter sat quietly in the corner, her fingers hovering over her stenography machine, ready to capture every single word. A lawyer began his interrogation with a series of highly aggressive, rapid-fire questions deliberately designed to disorient and confuse me. He paced around the small room, raising his voice and slamming his hands flat against the wooden table for dramatic effect. He tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive woman who was obsessively harassing her former husband and his innocent, generous family. I answered his ridiculous questions with calm, precise, one-word responses, giving him absolutely no emotional fuel to feed his theatrical performance. My total lack of reaction only infuriated him more. His face grew red, and the vein in his forehead began to pulse. Realizing that his legal intimidation was completely failing, he decided to abandon all professional decorum and dive straight into vicious personal attacks. He leaned across the table until his face was inches from mine, and his voice dropped to a cruel, mocking whisper. He asked me if my entire federal investigation was simply a pathetic, desperate attempt to punish Andre for moving on and finding a real woman. He stated loudly for the federal record that I was a barren, broken woman who was physically incapable of giving my husband a child. He went into agonizingly cruel detail about our failed medical treatments, using my most private medical history as a weapon to humiliate me. He said my infertility had rightfully destroyed my marriage, and now my bitter, uncontrollable jealousy was destroying my mind. He claimed I was exclusively targeting Andre's new pregnant fiancée because I could not handle my own biological failures and wanted to ruin the beautiful family I could never provide. Brenda let out a soft, cruel laugh from across the table, hiding her smirk behind her manicured hand. Andre sat back in his leather chair, puffing his chest out with arrogant pride, completely enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. Garrett watched me with a dark, calculating stare, waiting for me to snap. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry and scream and finally prove their false narrative that I was a hysterical, scorned woman who had lost her grip on reality. Instead, I did not even blink. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I let the silence stretch out in the freezing room until the lawyer's smug smirk slowly faded into deep, uncomfortable confusion. I looked directly at Andre and let a tiny, deeply condescending smile touch the corners of my mouth. I had spent a decade prosecuting hardened criminals, and I knew exactly how to manipulate a fragile, insecure male ego. I addressed the lawyer, but kept my eyes locked entirely on my former husband. I told the lawyer that his client was not the victim of a scorned woman, but rather a desperate, pathetic coward, hiding behind his mother's skirts to cover up his own massive financial incompetence. I let my voice drip with absolute disdain, as I stated that Andre did not even have the basic intellectual capacity to orchestrate the complex offshore deed transfers on his own. I looked at Garrett and praised his criminal genius, stating that Andre was nothing more than a dumb puppet who needed his white brother-in-law to hold his hand and wipe his nose every time he signed a business contract. I said Andre was far too weak and stupid to manage his own portfolio without Garrett pulling all the strings. It was the perfect bait. Andre's face flushed a dark, violent purple. His massive ego, already bruised by his failing businesses, could not handle being called incompetent, especially on a permanent federal transcript, and especially in front of Garrett, who always treated him like an inferior child. Andre slammed both of his fists on the table and lunged forward completely, ignoring his lawyer's frantic hand signals to stay quiet and let him handle the deposition. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Vivian," he shouted across the table, his voice echoing loudly in the sterile room. "You think I needed Garrett to handle my own properties and my own money? You think I am some kind of idiot? I handled the Buckhead Mansion transfer entirely by myself. I personally drafted the corporate release forms and I executed the final deed transfer to my mother's offshore trust account without any help from Garrett or anyone else. I secured my own assets while you were busy crying over pointless doctor appointments and feeling sorry for yourself." The senior litigation partner suddenly stopped pacing. He froze mid-step, his face instantly draining of all color until he looked like a walking corpse. He reached out and grabbed Andre's shoulder, digging his fingers into the fabric of his suit, trying to physically pull his client back into his chair, but Andre was too blinded by his own enraged pride to stop boasting. "I signed every single authorization document myself," Andre continued proudly, his voice echoing in the silent room, completely blind to the steel trap that had just slammed shut around his ankles. "I approved the commercial equity loans, and I authorized the final signature on the primary deed release." "You were completely clueless, Vivian. I took everything right out from under you, and there is nothing you can do about it." I slowly picked up my gold pen and made a single slow checkmark on my yellow legal pad. The silence that fell over the room this time was thick, heavy, and absolutely suffocating. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the court reporter's fingers flying across her machine, capturing every single word of his eager confession into the official federal record. I looked up at the senior partner who was now sweating profusely through his expensive charcoal suit, breathing heavily as if he were having a heart attack. I spoke clearly and deliberately, ensuring the court reporter captured my statement perfectly. I asked the lawyer to kindly remind his client that the Buckhead Mansion was purchased under a joint marital deed. I pointed out that legally releasing that specific property to an offshore trust required both of our signatures under strict federal banking regulations. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and locked eyes with Andre, whose arrogant, triumphant sneer was slowly beginning to falter as the reality of my words washed over him. You just stated on a federal deposition record that you personally executed the final deed transfer and signed every single authorization document yourself, I reminded him, my voice dropping to a cold, deadly whisper. But I never signed that release document, Andre. So you just formally confessed to committing felony document forgery and federal wire fraud while sitting on the record in a federal courthouse. Andre's mouth fell open in absolute horror as his slow brain finally caught up to his runaway mouth. He looked frantically at his lawyer for help, his eyes wide with sudden paralyzing terror. But the senior partner was already packing his leather briefcase with trembling, panicked hands. Brenda let out a sharp, terrified gasp, clapping her hands over her mouth as she realized her golden, perfect son had just handed me the absolute key to his own federal prison cell. Garrett pushed his chair violently back from the table, looking like he was about to physically run out of the room to save himself from the fallout. The highly expensive, confident lawyer did not even bother to consult with his newly doomed clients. He slammed his briefcase shut, snapping the brass locks with a loud crack, and addressed the court reporter, directly ignoring everyone else in the room. He stated in a shaking voice that he was halting the deposition immediately. He looked at Brenda, Andre, and Garrett with a mixture of absolute professional disgust and sheer survival panic. He told them that he was formally withdrawing as their legal counsel effective immediately because he absolutely refused to be associated with clients who brazenly confessed to federal felonies on a sworn federal record. He turned on his heel and walked rapidly out of the conference room without ever looking back, leaving the three of them sitting completely alone, trapped and utterly destroyed by their own bottomless arrogance. The sudden departure of their expensive corporate lawyer left Brenda, Andre, and Garrett in a state of temporary panic, but their bottomless arrogance quickly overshadowed their fear. They managed to hire a new defense attorney, a flashy local lawyer who cared more about media attention and aggressive posturing than actual legal strategy. Months of procedural delays and frantic legal maneuvering finally culminated in the first official day of the federal civil trial. The downtown courthouse was a towering monument of white marble and imposing columns, designed to make anyone walking through its heavy doors feel incredibly small. I arrived early, wearing a simple tailored black suit that cost less than $50. I carried nothing but a single slim leather briefcase. I took a seat on the hard wooden bench in the wide corridor outside the assigned courtroom. The air was cool and smelled of polished wood and floor wax. 30 minutes later, the heavy glass doors at the end of the hall swung open, and my former family made their grand entrance. Brenda, Andre, and Garrett strode down the marble corridor looking like they were walking a red carpet instead of entering a federal courthouse. They were draped head to toe in high-end designer clothing, flashing massive gold watches, and carrying bags that cost more than a reliable vehicle. They were laughing loudly, their voices echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, completely ignoring the solemn atmosphere of the legal building. Walking right beside Andre, clinging tightly to his arm, was Latoya. She was his new pregnant fiancée. The woman he had so proudly claimed was a real woman compared to me. Latoya was wearing a skin-tight, bright red designer dress that prominently displayed her growing belly. She threw her head back and laughed loudly at something Garrett said, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. They looked like a victorious royal family marching to claim their throne and crush a peasant. Brenda spotted me sitting alone on the wooden bench, and her loud laughter abruptly stopped. A vicious, cruel smile spread across her heavily powdered face. She broke away from her group and marched directly over to me, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Andre and Latoya followed close behind, wearing matching expressions of deep condescension. Garrett hung back slightly, leaning against the marble wall, but the smug satisfaction on his face was unmistakable. Brenda looked down at my simple black suit and let out a loud, theatrical sigh of fake pity. She asked me where my legal representation was and mocked me for sitting all alone in the hallway like a lost child. She told me it was incredibly pathetic that I was too poor to even hire a public defender to hold my hand while I lost everything. She boasted that their new lawyer was going to tear me apart, and make sure I paid their legal fees for the rest of my miserable life. LaToya chimed in, rubbing her pregnant belly with a deliberate mocking gesture. She sneered that it was sad watching a bitter, lonely woman try to fight a family of highly successful entrepreneurs. She told me I should stop acting so jealous just because I could not give Andre a real family. Andre laughed, his chest puffing out with that familiar toxic pride. He told me I should have taken their settlement offer when I had the chance, because now his legal team was going to completely obliterate me in front of the judge and strip away every last dime I had to my name. I did not react to their insults. I did not rise to the bait or show a single ounce of emotion. I simply looked at Brenda's heavily contoured face and told her that the courtroom doors were unlocking. I stood up, smoothed the front of my cheap black blazer, and walked past them into the vast wood-paneled courtroom. I walked straight past the gallery benches and pushed open the low, swinging wooden gate that separated the spectators from the legal counsel tables. I calmly took my seat at the plaintiff's table, entirely alone. Brenda, Andre, LaToya, and Garrett filed into the room a moment later. They took the seats behind the defendant's table, whispering to their flashy new lawyer and pointing in my direction with wide, arrogant smiles. They were absolutely certain that my lack of legal representation meant I was completely defenseless and entirely unprepared for the reality of a federal trial. Their lawyer shuffled his massive stacks of paper, looking over at me with a dismissive chuckle, clearly believing this would be the easiest victory of his career. The heavy wooden door behind the bench suddenly opened, and the court bailiff loudly ordered everyone to rise. The federal judge walked into the room, his black robe billowing behind him. He was a stern, intimidating man with a reputation for running a flawless courtroom and showing absolutely no mercy to corporate fraudsters. He climbed the steps to his elevated bench and arranged his documents before telling the room to be seated. Brenda and her group sat down, their faces glowing with arrogant anticipation. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the courtroom, taking in the defense table with a blank, professional expression. Then his eyes moved across the room and locked directly onto me, sitting alone at the plaintiff's table. The stern, harsh lines of the judge's face instantly softened into a look of deep, profound professional respect. A warm, genuine smile spread across his face, completely breaking his intimidating demeanor. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the high wooden bench. "Good morning, counselor," the judge said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity through the silent courtroom. "It is a profound honor to see you in my courtroom again after all these years." The entire opposing family froze. Brenda's cruel smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Andre's mouth dropped open, and he turned to stare at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a demon. Garrett gripped the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned completely white, his arrogant posture crumbling into dust. Their flashy new lawyer stopped shuffling his papers, his hands freezing midair as the blood rapidly drained from his face. He slowly turned his head to look at me, pure dread radiating from his eyes. I stood up from my chair and opened my slim leather briefcase. I pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper and stepped forward to hand it to the court clerk. I kept my voice perfectly calm, level, and devoid of any emotion as I addressed the judge. "Good morning, Your Honor," I replied, the sound of my voice carrying easily across the massive room. "I am submitting my formal notice of appearance for the record. I am acting as my own legal representation in this matter." I turned my head just slightly to look directly at the terrified faces of my former family. I watched their eyes widen in absolute horror as I finished my sentence. "I am representing myself in my capacity as the former chief prosecutor of the Federal Financial Crimes Bureau, and I am fully prepared to begin this trial." The absolute silence in the federal courtroom was deafening after my announcement. The federal judge gave a firm, slow nod of profound respect, acknowledging my credentials, while the opposing table looked like they had been struck by a massive bolt of lightning. Their flashy new defense lawyer tried to stutter out a frantic objection, but the judge immediately silenced him with a single sharp look of authority. I did not waste a single second relishing in their shock. "Your Honor, I call Andre to the stand." I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. Andre stood up on trembling legs. Latoya tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away, looking pale and suddenly very sickly. He walked to the witness box and placed his hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the whole truth. He tried to puff out his chest and project the image of a wealthy, highly successful entrepreneur, but his eyes were darting around the massive wood-paneled room like a terrified, trapped animal. I walked up to the podium carrying a thick, heavy stack of bank statements, credit reports, and tax filings. I started with simple foundational questions about his supposed business empire. I handed him a copy of his corporate tax returns from the last 5 years. I asked him to explain to the court how his highly successful real estate consulting firm had reported zero actual revenue for half a decade. His new lawyer jumped up to object, claiming relevance, but the judge overruled him instantly, commanding Andre to answer the question directly. Andre mumbled something completely incoherent about market fluctuations and strategic corporate losses. I smiled a cold, small smile and pulled out the next stack of documents. I presented the joint credit card statements that I had personally maintained and paid for during our entire marriage. I walked the judge through every single line item, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Andre's entire luxurious lifestyle was funded exclusively by my pristine credit rating and his mother's extremely shady church donations. I asked him to read aloud the monthly wire transfers from Brenda's Sanctuary Charity Fund directly into his personal checking account. The amounts were absolutely staggering. Brenda sat in the gallery, her face buried in her trembling hands, realizing her own massive financial crimes were now being permanently entered into the public federal record. I paced slowly in front of the witness box, refusing to let him breathe or regroup for even a second. I asked him how he managed to lease his luxury sports cars, buy his custom-tailored designer suits, and pay for his exclusive country club memberships, when his own business bank accounts were constantly overdrawn. I handed him financial documents showing that I had paid his car note every single month, while he arrogantly told his friends and congregants that he was a self-made millionaire. I forced him to look at the paperwork and admit for the court that his entire existence was subsidized by the hardworking women in his life. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive silk collar suddenly looking very tight around his neck as he wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. I moved immediately to his frequent international business trips. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs and luxury hotel receipts, dropping them onto the wooden ledge of the witness box so they scattered right in front of his face. You told me, and you told this court, that your quarterly trips to Dubai, Paris, and the Bahamas were absolutely essential for securing overseas real estate investors, I said smoothly, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. I handed him a receipt for a $50,000 stay at a private beachfront resort in the Maldives. I asked him to explain exactly how spending my hard-earned salary on private villas, vintage champagne, and custom designer jewelry for 3 different mistresses contributed to his real estate portfolio. The gallery erupted into loud gasps and shocked whispers. Latoya let out a sharp, devastated cry from her seat, her hands flying to her pregnant belly as she realized she was not the only other woman in his life. She looked at the clear, glossy photos of Andre holding hands and kissing other women in Paris, and her face contorted with absolute fury and deep betrayal. She thought she had stolen a wealthy, successful man, but she was just realizing she was tied to a broke serial cheater. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down hard, demanding immediate order in the court, but the psychological damage to the defense was already completely done. Andre looked out at Latoya, begging her with his eyes to understand, but she turned her head away in absolute disgust. His entire fake, carefully constructed world was collapsing right in front of his face. I leaned much closer to the witness box, holding up the fraudulent property transfer documents that he had so proudly admitted to signing during his disastrous deposition. I asked him point blank how a man who could not even afford to buy his own groceries managed to successfully orchestrate a complex, multi-million-dollar international real estate laundering scheme. I asked him how a man who failed basic college accounting was able to create highly complex offshore shell companies to hide millions in stolen church funds. I fired the questions relentlessly, not giving him a single moment to think or look at his lawyer for help. The relentless crushing pressure was simply too much for his incredibly fragile, insecure ego. The arrogant, confident facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. Andre broke down, sobbing heavily right there in the federal witness box. The proud, arrogant man who had constantly belittled me, who had paraded his pregnant mistress in front of me, who had laughed cruelly at my pain, was now a weeping, hyperventilating mess, wiping his running nose on his expensive suit sleeve. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror, and then he looked frantically across the room at Garrett, who was sitting completely frozen at the defense table. "It was not me!" Andre cried out loudly, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic panic as heavy tears streamed down his face. "I am not smart enough to do any of this, I promise." It was all Garrett. Garrett set up all the shell companies, and Garrett forced me to sign those transfer papers. He orchestrated the entire real estate fraud scheme from the very beginning, and he made me do it to hide all the stolen money. The echo of Andre's pathetic sobbing hung in the massive courtroom like a thick fog. The federal judge stared down at the witness box with a look of absolute disgust. He struck his wooden gavel once and ordered the bailiff to escort my weeping former husband back to the defense table. Andre stumbled away completely broken, leaving a trail of shattered arrogance behind him. The judge turned his piercing gaze back to me and nodded for me to continue. I did not miss a single beat. I called Garrett to the stand. Garrett stood up from the defense table. He shot a look of pure venom at Andre before smoothing the front of his custom-tailored suit. He walked toward the witness box with long, confident strides, desperately trying to project the image of an untouchable corporate mastermind. He swore on the Bible and sat down, crossing one leg over the other and leaning back in the heavy wooden chair. He looked at me with a defiant, mocking glare. He clearly believed that because he was a wealthy, educated white man operating in the shadows of high finance, a former prosecutor like me could never possibly unravel his complex corporate web. I approached the podium carrying a new stack of documents. I started by asking him about the offshore accounts and the shell companies that Andre had just confessed to using. Garrett let out a condescending sigh. He used a deeply patronizing tone as he began to weave a massive web of deceptive corporate jargon. He told the court that I simply lacked the financial literacy to understand high-level wealth management. He used terms like synergistic asset reallocation, aggressive tax mitigation strategies, and standard corporate shielding. He claimed that the Sanctuary Charity Fund had willingly entered into a sophisticated investment portfolio and that all the missing money was merely tied up in leveraged equity. He smiled at the judge, acting as if this was all just a massive misunderstanding brought on by an emotional woman who did not understand basic economics. I let him talk. I let him fill the federal record with his arrogant lies and his complicated buzzwords. When he finally finished his condescending lecture, I did not argue with his definitions. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick binder filled with printed emails. I placed the binder on the podium and watched Garrett's eyes narrow. I calmly informed the court that during my federal investigation, I had legally subpoenaed the servers of his private wealth management firm. I explained that Garrett had hidden his most sensitive communications behind heavily encrypted military-grade firewalls, assuming they would never be breached. I let a cold smile touch my lips as I told him that federal cybercrimes units were significantly smarter than his private IT department. Garrett's defiant posture instantly stiffened. The smug color began to drain from his face as I opened the binder. I told the court that these decrypted internal emails completely destroyed his pathetic narrative about legitimate investments. These emails proved that Garrett was not just hiding stolen church funds, but that he was operating a vicious illegal real estate syndicate. I pulled out the first email and read it aloud for the entire courtroom to hear. The email detailed a calculated predatory lending scheme. Garrett had intentionally used Brenda's position as a highly trusted religious leader to target the most vulnerable members of her own congregation. The emails explicitly listed dozens of elderly Black families who had gone to Brenda for spiritual and financial counseling during hard times. Instead of helping them, Brenda had funneled their private financial information directly to Garrett. Garrett then used his anonymous shell companies to offer these desperate families predatory loans with hidden ballooning interest rates that they could never possibly repay. I pulled out another email and read Garrett's own vicious words. He had written to his business partners laughing about how incredibly easy it was to steal generational wealth from trusting churchgoers. He detailed how he would wait for the families to default on his predatory loans and then aggressively foreclose on their properties. He was stealing homes that had been in these Black families for generations, evicting the elderly congregants onto the streets, and then flipping their properties to wealthy developers for massive, untraceable profits. The gallery erupted. The courtroom was packed with former members of Brenda's church, and the sound of their collective outrage and heartbreak shook the walls. People were crying out in horror, realizing that their beloved pastor and her brilliant son-in-law had been systematically hunting them like prey. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. His face flushed with absolute fury as he glared down at the witness box. Brenda was hyperventilating at the defense table, gripping her chest, as she realized her entire community now knew she had sold them out for profit. Garrett was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was sitting bolt upright, gripping the wooden rails of the witness box. A thick layer of cold sweat covered his pale forehead. His custom suit suddenly looked wrinkled and suffocating. The confident corporate jargon completely abandoned him. I walked right up to the edge of the witness box, holding up an email dated just 3 months prior. I stared directly into Garrett's terrified eyes. I asked him to confirm that in this specific email he had authorized the immediate winter eviction of an 82-year-old widow who had been a founding member of Brenda's church. I asked him to explain exactly what kind of synergistic asset reallocation required throwing an elderly woman out into the freezing rain so he could bulldoze her family home. Garrett stared at the paper in my hand. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He looked frantically at his new defense lawyer, who simply looked down at the table, refusing to meet his eyes. Garrett looked up at the federal judge, who was leaning over the bench with a gaze so dark and punishing it could have melted steel. Garrett realized he was trapped in a perfect, inescapable legal nightmare. Every single word he spoke now would only serve to lock the doors of his federal prison cell. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. His voice trembled violently, stripping away every last ounce of his arrogant privilege as he finally spoke into the microphone. "On the advice of counsel?" Garrett stammered, staring down at his shaking hands. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." I respectfully refused to answer that question. He repeated the phrase for the next document and the next. With every refusal to answer, the deafening silence in the federal courtroom grew heavier. His desperate, cowardly silence became the most damning piece of evidence of all, absolutely confirming the monstrous depths of their predatory crimes. The heavy silence following Garrett's cowardly refusal to answer hung in the air like thick smoke. The federal judge looked down at Garrett with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt before ordering him to step down from the stand. Garrett practically scrambled out of the witness box, his expensive custom suit now clinging to his sweating back. He slinked back to the defense table, completely unable to look at anyone in the room. The gallery was buzzing with furious whispers as the congregants realized the depth of the betrayal. I did not let the momentum fade or the tension drop for a single second. I looked directly at the defense table and called Brenda to the stand. Brenda stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table as if she were a fragile, elderly woman about to collapse from the sheer stress of it all. She slowly made her way to the witness box, dramatically dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a white lace handkerchief. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath, pressing her palm against the book with deep theatrical devotion. She sat down and immediately turned her tear-filled eyes toward the judge. She was fully prepared to play the role of the pious, devoted matriarch who was being cruelly victimized and harassed by an evil, vindictive daughter-in-law. I approached the podium with a massive new stack of financial ledgers and banking records. Before I could even ask my very first question, Brenda began to wail loud enough for the entire room to hear. She cried out that this entire trial was a vicious witch hunt designed to destroy her holy ministry. She told the court that she had welcomed me into her blessed family with open arms, and that I had repaid her grace with nothing but bitterness and absolute deceit. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and raised her voice to a theatrical pitch. She called me a barren woman. She screamed that I was a parasite who had sucked the life and joy out of her perfect son simply because I was physically incapable of giving him a child. She sobbed uncontrollably, claiming I was a complete failure as a wife and as a woman, and that this federal lawsuit was just the pathetic revenge of a barren, broken parasite trying to destroy the beautiful family I could never have. The crowded courtroom gasped at her viciously cruel personal attacks. Her flashy defense lawyer looked visibly relieved, leaning back in his chair, thinking she had successfully deflected the attention away from the actual fraud and turned it into a petty family dispute. But I did not flinch. I did not let a single emotion cross my face. I simply let her ugly insults echo and fade into the high vaulted ceiling of the room. I looked down at the financial ledgers in my hands and then back up at Brenda's heavily powdered face. I told her in a deadly calm voice that we were going to examine exactly who the real parasite was. I opened the heavy ledger representing her church's primary charity fund. I asked her to look at the massive withdrawals made every single week over the last 4 years. I asked her why the specific charity account legally designated for feeding the homeless and housing the poor was completely barren. I repeated the word, letting it slice through the cold air of the courtroom. I asked her how an account that received millions of dollars in faithful donations from working-class families could remain so utterly barren month after month. Brenda stuttered, her fake tears instantly drying up as she was forced to look at the cold, hard numbers projected onto the monitors. I did not give her a chance to formulate a lie. I pulled out the extensive records of her personal luxury expenses. I showed the court the undeniable receipts for her designer clothes, her private spa retreats, her first-class international flights, and her solid gold jewelry. I asked her if draining the life savings of her hard-working congregation to fund her lavish lifestyle made her a parasite. I repeated the word, leaning closer to the microphone. I asked if feeding off the blind faith and deep trust of the elderly widows in her church to line her own pockets made her the ultimate parasite. Brenda's face turned a dark, mottled purple. She gripped the microphone and tried to shout over me, claiming that her ministry was highly successful and that she was meant to be abundantly blessed for her spiritual leadership. I slammed the next stack of documents onto the podium, silencing her completely. I asked her to explain the systemic failure of her charitable outreach programs. I used her exact insult against her. I pointed to the forged invoices, the phantom construction projects for community centers that were never built, and the fake youth scholarships that were never actually awarded. I asked her to explain this massive moral and financial failure. Barren, parasite, failure. I hammered her own vicious words into the federal record over and over again, connecting each insult she had just thrown at me directly to a specific, undeniable piece of evidence proving her massive financial rot. Brenda was shaking violently now, her pious innocent mask completely shattered. She looked frantically up at the judge and claimed she knew absolutely nothing about any of the money laundering or the fake accounts. She cried real tears of panic, claiming she was just a simple, devoted pastor who trusted the wrong people. She blamed Garrett entirely, just like her son Andre had done an hour earlier. She swore under oath that Garrett handled all the complex finances, and she had simply signed the documents without understanding them because she trusted her family. It was the exact lie I had been waiting for all morning. I smiled a cold, deadly smile and told the court that I had one final piece of evidence to submit for this witness. I picked up a small black digital audio player from my briefcase and connected it to the courtroom's main audio system. I explained that during the forensic federal audit of the church's internal servers, the cybercrimes unit had recovered deleted audio files from the dictation software used by her chief accountant. I pressed play and stepped back from the podium. The crisp, clear sound of Brenda's voice instantly filled the silent courtroom. It was not the sweet, pious, gentle tone she used from the pulpit, or the weeping voice she had just used on the stand. It was sharp, ruthless, and dripping with greed. On the recording, Brenda was explicitly instructing her chief accountant on exactly how to route the stolen donation money through Garrett's shell companies to avoid IRS detection. She was laughing cruelly on the tape, mocking the congregation for being so incredibly stupid and blindly handing over their paychecks. She explicitly stated on the recording that Garrett and Andre were just her useful idiots, and that she was the one pulling every single string to build her own personal empire. The recording kept playing her own words echoing off the marble walls, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the holy matriarch was the vicious, calculating mastermind behind the entire criminal enterprise. The echo of Brenda's vicious laughing voice on the audio recording finally faded, leaving the massive courtroom in a state of absolute stunned paralysis. Brenda sat in the witness box, her jaw hanging slack, her face drained of all the expensive bronzer she had carefully applied that morning. She had no more fake tears to cry. Her own recorded words had completely destroyed her pious matriarch mask. The judge looked at her with a disgust so deep it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He quietly ordered her to step down and return to the defense table. She moved like a ghost, practically dragging her feet across the marble floor. "Your Honor, I call my final witness to the stand," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I call LaToya Davis." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. At the defense table, LaToya physically jumped in her seat. Her hands flew to her tight red designer dress directly over her prominent pregnant belly. Her flashy new defense lawyer frantically stood up, shouting objections about surprise witnesses and irrelevant testimony. But I simply handed the court clerk a copy of the amended witness list I had filed hours before the trial began. The judge waved off the defense lawyer with a sharp flick of his wrist and ordered LaToya to take the stand. She walked forward slowly, her high heels clicking unevenly. The arrogant swagger she had displayed in the hallway was entirely gone. She looked terrified. She swore the oath and sat down, gripping the edges of the wooden chair. I walked to the podium and looked at her. I did not bring any documents this time. I knew exactly what was running through her mind. She had just sat through 3 hours of watching her golden ticket family get completely dismantled. She had seen Andre exposed as a broke puppet, Garrett outed as a predatory criminal, and Brenda revealed as a ruthless mastermind. LaToya had tied her entire future to this family, expecting a life of endless luxury and massive payouts. Instead, she was now staring down the barrel of crushing federal investigations and the sudden, terrifying realization that Andre had absolutely no money to pay her mounting credit card debts. I started with her financial situation. I asked her if she was aware that the luxury condo she was currently leasing was in the process of being foreclosed on because Garrett's shell company had stopped paying the rent. I asked her if she knew that the Black Diamond credit card she had been using to buy her designer maternity clothes was actually registered to one of Brenda's fraudulent church charity accounts, which was now entirely frozen by the federal government. LaToya's eyes darted wildly around the room. She looked at Andre, who was staring at the floor, refusing to help her. She looked at Brenda, who was glaring at her with pure venom, silently threatening her to keep her mouth shut. But LaToya was young, and she was selfish, and she had absolutely no loyalty to a sinking ship. The reality of massive debt and potential prison time finally broke her resolve. I stepped closer to the witness box and lowered my voice. I asked her to tell the court about the baby. I reminded her that she had filed multiple sworn affidavits in our preliminary divorce hearings, demanding massive child support and temporary spousal maintenance, claiming the stress of my harassment was endangering her unborn child. I asked her exactly how far along she was. Latoya opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at the federal judge, who was leaning forward over his high bench, his eyes narrowing as he sensed her hesitation. The judge warned her sharply that she was under oath in a federal courtroom and that any deception would be met with severe consequences. That was the final push she needed to save herself. Latoya let out a loud, ugly sob that held no actual sorrow, just pure, desperate self-preservation. She grabbed the fabric of her tight red dress right at the waistline. She told the court through hysterical, gasping breaths that she could not go to jail for them. She screamed that she was drowning in debt, and that Andre had promised her a mansion and $1 million if she just played along with the plan. She reached under the hem of her dress and unhooked a series of hidden clasps. The courtroom erupted in shock as she reached inside and literally pulled out a curved silicone maternity prosthetic, dropping the fake belly onto the wooden ledge of the witness box with a dull, heavy thud. "I am not pregnant," Latoya cried out, shrinking back into her chair as the gallery completely lost its mind. "I was never pregnant. There is no baby." I did not let the chaos stop me. I raised my voice over the screaming gallery and demanded to know whose idea the fake pregnancy was. Latoya pointed a shaking finger directly at Brenda, who was now screaming and trying to lunge out of her seat. "It was her," Latoya sobbed into the microphone, pointing at the enraged matriarch. "Brenda planned the whole thing. She knew about all your failed medical treatments. She knew how much it hurt you that you were infertile. She hired me and bought the prosthetic. She told me to parade it in front of you and rub it in your face at every single public event. She said if we broke you psychologically, if we made you feel like a complete barren failure, you would be too depressed and humiliated to fight the divorce. She said you would just walk away with nothing and never bother to look into the church bank accounts." The sheer monstrous cruelty of the plot hung over the courtroom. People in the gallery were standing up, shouting in pure disgust at Brenda. But the loudest sound in the room was the deafening crack of the judge's heavy wooden gavel. He slammed it down against the sounding block so hard the wood nearly splintered. His face was a mask of absolute terrifying fury. He stood up behind the bench, his black robe swirling around him. He pointed his gavel directly at Latoya, who was still cowering in the witness box. He bellowed that she had willfully submitted fraudulent sworn affidavits to a federal court and had made an absolute mockery of the justice system for financial gain. He ordered the federal bailiffs to place Latoya under immediate arrest for multiple counts of perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. The courtroom descended into pure, unadulterated chaos. 2 armed bailiffs rushed the witness stand, grabbing Latoya by the arms as she screamed and kicked violently, begging for mercy. Brenda was shrieking at the top of her lungs, pointing at me and cursing my name as her own lawyer desperately tried to physically hold her back. Andre was curled into a ball in his chair, weeping loudly with his hands over his ears, while Garrett sat completely frozen, staring blankly ahead as the handcuffs clicked loudly around Latoya's wrists. The reality of the cold, heavy steel locking around her wrists suddenly shattered whatever self-preservation instincts Latoya had left. The initial shock of her arrest instantly morphed into a blind, violent rage. Instead of submitting quietly to the federal officers, she completely lost her mind. She violently twisted her body, ripping her arms away from the bailiffs, and jumped up from the witness box, screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that she was not going to federal prison and that I had manipulated this entire situation to ruin her perfect new life. Her face was red and twisted with fury as she screamed, trying to protect the very people she had just exposed. She shouted that Andre was a good husband and that Brenda had treated her like a real mother, and that I was the only actual monster in the room for tearing their beautiful family apart. She lunged directly toward my table, her handcuffed wrists raised in the air and her manicured nails reaching out like claws aimed right at my face. She did not even make it 2 steps. Before she could cross the short distance, the 2 heavy-set federal bailiffs immediately tackled her. They wrapped their thick arms around her waist and dragged her backward away from me. She kicked and thrashed violently, her expensive designer heels scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She was spitting and cursing completely, abandoning the elegant, wealthy persona she had tried so hard to portray. The entire gallery watched in stunned, horrified silence as the future daughter-in-law of their former pastor acted like a feral animal in the middle of a federal courthouse. The church members who had been scammed out of their life savings watched her thrash around with a mixture of deep disgust and tragic vindication. I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of fear as she lunged at me. I stood perfectly still, watching her completely humiliate herself on the public record. The judge was roaring for order, his face dark with fury, but I simply ignored the chaos and reached into my leather briefcase one last time. I pulled out a thick, bound folder and let it drop onto my wooden table with a heavy, echoing thud. The sound cut through LaToya's frantic screaming, causing her to freeze and look at me with wide, terrified eyes. She knew exactly what that folder represented. I raised my voice so the court reporter could easily capture every single word over the remaining noise in the room. I stated for the official record that my final piece of evidence proved LaToya was not just a hired actress playing the role of a pregnant mistress to cause emotional damage. She was not just an innocent bystander who got caught up in Brenda's vicious psychological warfare against me. I explained that LaToya was a deeply active and incredibly greedy participant in the massive financial fraud scheme that had ruined so many innocent lives. I opened the heavy folder and read the signature logs from the church's secondary charity accounts. The documents clearly proved that once Brenda realized the federal investigators were closing in on her and Garrett, she had panicked and transferred signing authority directly into LaToya's name. Brenda had used her future daughter-in-law as a blind shield, and LaToya had eagerly accepted the role for a cut of the profits. I looked right at LaToya, who was now sagging against the officers holding her, and told the court that she was the one who had personally authorized over $300,000 in fraudulent withdrawals over the last 4 months alone. I read the itemized receipts aloud for everyone to hear. I detailed how LaToya had used the money explicitly meant for the church's homeless shelter to buy her luxury sports car, her massive diamond engagement ring, and the absolute mountain of designer bags and shoes sitting in her new closet. I pointed out that she had funded her lavish, fake lifestyle by draining the exact accounts meant to feed starving families during the winter. She was not just an accomplice to Brenda's emotional abuse, she was a central figure in the federal wire fraud scheme, and her fingerprints were on every single stolen dollar. I told the court that she had stolen from the poorest members of the community just to buy high-end cosmetics and custom silk dresses. LaToya's screaming instantly stopped. The frantic fight completely drained out of her body, and she slumped like dead weight against the officers. Andre looked at her with pure, devastating shock, realizing that the woman he had left me for the woman he claimed was a real partner had been secretly draining the last of the stolen funds behind his back to buy herself jewelry. Brenda let out a horrifying guttural wail from the defense table, realizing that every single firewall she had built to protect herself had been systematically obliterated by my evidence. Garrett just kept staring at the blank wall, completely broken and silent, knowing his life was entirely over. The federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel one final time, the sound ringing out through the room like a gunshot. The entire courtroom instantly fell into a terrified, dead silence. The judge looked down at the defense table with absolute, unmasked disgust. He stated loudly that in his 30 years on the federal bench, he had never witnessed such a repulsive display of greed, arrogance, and blatant criminal conspiracy. He looked at Brenda, Andre, Garrett, and LaToya as if they were trash stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He announced with a booming voice that the frivolous civil lawsuit filed against me was dismissed with extreme prejudice, effective immediately. He stated that they would never be allowed to harass me in a court of law ever again. But he did not stop there. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with absolute authority, and declared that he was transferring the entire case file, including all of my decrypted evidence and the live courtroom confessions, directly to the Federal Criminal Investigation Division. He issued an immediate permanent arrest warrant for Latoya for her prior perjury and instructed the bailiffs to take her away to a holding cell. The courtroom descended into pure chaos as the judge ordered the room cleared, leaving my former family trapped, entirely destroyed, and facing years in federal prison. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind the judge, leaving a vacuum of pure terror in his wake. The echoing screams of Latoya being dragged down the marble corridor faded into a chilling silence. At the defense table, the reality of the situation finally crashed down upon my former family. The impenetrable shield of the Blackwood Empire had not just been cracked, it had been entirely pulverized. Brenda was hyperventilating, grasping at her pearl necklace, and gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. Her expensive high-profile defense attorney did not even bother to comfort her. He was shoving his legal pads and gold pens into his leather briefcase with frantic, desperate movements. He refused to make eye contact with Brenda or Garrett, muttering under his breath about a severe conflict of interest before he practically sprinted out the side door of the courtroom. He knew a doomed ship when he saw one, and he was not about to let his own legal license go down with them. Andre was curled into a pathetic ball in his chair, his face buried in his hands as he wept loudly. He was rocking back and forth, completely broken by the revelation that his young mistress had played him for a fool, and that his mother had orchestrated his entire miserable life. But Garrett did not cry. Garrett went into pure, cold survival mode. The arrogant corporate mastermind who had smirked at me just hours ago was now pale and sweating profusely. His hands shook violently as he reached into his custom-tailored suit pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He immediately began swiping and tapping, trying to activate his emergency contingency plans. I stood perfectly still at the plaintiff table, watching his every move. I watched Garrett dial his offshore bankers, his private wealth fixers, and his corrupt board members. He was desperately trying to pull whatever invisible strings he had left to secure a private jet and a safe passage out of the country. I watched his facial expression morph from frantic hope to absolute raw terror. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the glowing screen in sheer disbelief. He dialed another contact, and then another. He paced back and forth behind the defense table, whispering frantically into the receiver, but getting nothing in return. Every single line was dead. Every offshore account had already been frozen by federal authorities. Every corrupt business partner and high society friend had completely cut ties and blocked his number the second the news of the federal audit leaked from the courthouse. Garrett was completely isolated and trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Brenda reached out and grabbed Garrett's arm, digging her manicured nails into his expensive jacket. She begged him to do something to call the bank to get them out of this disaster. Garrett just looked at her with empty, hollow eyes and shook his head. His voice trembled as he whispered that everything was gone. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden table and walked slowly into the center of the federal courtroom. The click of my heels echoed loudly against the marble floor, cutting through their panic. The remaining gallery members, the heartbroken church congregants who had stayed behind, watched me in stunned silence. I stopped a few feet away from the defense table, standing tall and completely calm. Andre looked up at me with puffy red eyes, his face smeared with tears and snot. Brenda glared at me with absolute murderous hatred, but she was shaking so hard she could not even stand up to face me. I looked down at the three of them and let a cold, hard smile touch my face. I told them they were free to stop looking for an exit because there was absolutely no way out of this building. Brenda tried to spit a curse at me, but her voice caught in her dry throat. I coldly informed them that this entire civil trial had never been about winning a simple divorce settlement or dividing up a suburban house. I told them that a standard civil suit could never properly punish them for the monstrous things they had done to those innocent elderly families. I explained that this entire courtroom proceeding, every single document I submitted, every surprise witness I called, every piece of evidence I strategically dropped, was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated stage play. I watched the color completely drain from Garrett's face as my words sank in. I told them I needed them in a federal courtroom. I needed them sitting in that witness box swearing a holy oath on the Bible. I knew their blinding arrogance and their massive egos would force them to lie under oath to protect their stolen wealth. I explained that federal prosecutors needed absolute bulletproof sworn testimonies to legally pierce through Garrett's complex corporate shell companies. By forcing them to aggressively defend themselves in a highly publicized civil trial, I had essentially handed the Federal Criminal Division a perfectly wrapped indictment file, complete with live sworn confessions and undeniable perjury. I looked directly into Garrett's eyes and told him that they had literally dug their own graves and willingly jumped inside, all because they truly believed I was just a bitter, barren woman trying to steal their money. Their own toxic misogyny and narcissism had blinded them to the trap I had laid right under their feet. I turned to Brenda and told her that her holy empire was officially dead, and that her grand spiritual legacy would be nothing but a federal inmate number. Andre fell to his knees on the hard courtroom floor. He crawled toward me, sobbing uncontrollably and begging me to stop this madness. He grabbed at the hem of my skirt, crying that he was so sorry, that he never meant to hurt me, and that he still loved me. He pleaded with me to save him from federal prison. I looked down at the pathetic broken man I had once called my husband. I slowly pulled my skirt out of his weak, trembling grasp and took a step back. I told him he should save his pathetic apologies for the federal agents. Exactly as the words left my mouth, the massive, heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. The loud, violent crash echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling, making everyone in the room jump in terror. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with FBI printed in bold yellow letters stormed into the room. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, marching down the center aisle and completely surrounding the defense table. The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a thick stack of official paperwork. He looked directly at my former mother-in-law and her brilliant son-in-law. He announced in a booming voice that Garrett and Brenda were under immediate arrest for massive wire fraud and multi-million-dollar money laundering. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom, sealing their permanent fate. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped harshly around Brenda's wrists, clicking with a sharp finality that echoed through the room. She shrieked in absolute terror, thrashing her arms wildly as the federal agents locked her firmly in place. Her massive, expensive custom-made church hat was knocked completely off her head in the struggle. It tumbled to the hard marble floor and was instantly trampled beneath the heavy black boots of the FBI agents without a single ounce of mercy. She was no longer the untouchable holy matriarch of a megachurch, but just another common criminal crying for a salvation that would never come. Across the table, Garrett tried desperately to put up a fight. He shoved his shoulder into one of the arresting agents, shouting that he was a licensed wealth manager and demanding his right to call his lawyer. The federal agents did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They grabbed Garrett by the back of his expensive tailored suit collar and slammed him face first right onto the hard wooden defense table. His nose cracked against the polished wood, and they forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back, locking him up tight. Amidst the deafening chaos of the arrests, Andre fell heavily to his knees on the courtroom floor, right at my feet. He was a completely broken shell of a man, stripped of all his unearned arrogance and pathetic pride. His face was covered in a messy mixture of snot and tears as he looked up at me from the ground. He reached out with shaking hands, begging me to stop the agents from taking his family away. He sobbed loudly, pleading with me to remember the 10 years of marriage we had shared together. He cried that we used to be so happy and that I could not just let them take his mother and his best friend away to federal prison. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the man sobbing on the floor. I slowly stepped back, pulling my expensive shoes away from his desperate, grasping hands. I looked down at him with dead, empty eyes. I let the absolute cold silence of my stare freeze the tears right on his pathetic face. I leaned down just enough so he could hear my voice over the frantic screaming of his mother. "I was never your barren parasite wife. I pronounced clearly with a cold, deadly calm. I am your death sentence. I stood back up, completely unbothered by the destruction happening all around me. I calmly picked up my worn leather briefcase from the plaintiff table, turned my back on my former family, and walked straight out of the federal courthouse, leaving them to drown in the inescapable nightmare they had built for themselves. Exactly 6 months later, the local television news stations were still running the spectacular footage of their massive downfall. Sitting in my living room, I watched the rapid-fire montage of their final sentencing hearings, broadcasted for the entire city to see. Brenda and Garrett were both found guilty on dozens of federal counts of wire fraud and money laundering. The judge showed them absolutely zero leniency. They were each handed massive 15-year sentences in a maximum security federal prison with absolutely no possibility of parole. Brenda's fake holy empire was completely liquidated by the federal government to pay back every single cent to the elderly congregants she had ruthlessly robbed. The news anchor then showed a brief, humiliating clip of LaToya. She had barely managed to avoid a federal prison cell by eagerly turning state evidence against the family, but her life was entirely ruined anyway. She was completely bankrupt, and her luxury cars and designer bags had been seized. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment in a heavily run-down neighborhood, far away from the lavish lifestyle she had tried so desperately to steal. And then there was Andre. He was completely cut out of his mother's frozen accounts and left with absolutely nothing but massive court-ordered restitution debts. The final news clip showed my former husband wearing a stained gray uniform, scrubbing the dirty linoleum floors of a local fast food restaurant, working a miserable minimum wage job just to barely survive the crushing weight of his own terrible choices. I turned off the television and grabbed my briefcase. I stepped out of my sleek black car and strode confidently into a massive high-end glass office building right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The security guards and professional staff nodded to me with deep respect as I walked past the reception desk. My relentless pursuit of justice and my total systematic dismantling of a multi-million-dollar fraud ring had caught the immediate attention of the city's highest legal officials. I walked into my sprawling corner office, taking my rightful seat as the newly appointed district attorney. I walked over and stood before the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling city streets below. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass buildings, filling my office with a brilliant, blinding light. The heavy oak doors behind me opened, and my new assistant walked in, holding a thick, heavily redacted legal file. She quietly announced that the mayor's office had just forwarded a massive new high-profile public corruption case directly to my desk. I looked down at the thick stack of evidence and gave a sharp, icy smile. I slowly buttoned my tailored suit jacket, feeling the absolute surging power of the moment. Nothing is sweeter than cleaning this city of its worst filth. The greatest lesson from Vivian's journey is that true power does not come from lowering yourself to your abuser's level, but from outsmarting them with undeniable truth and unwavering patience. When toxic family members mistake your quiet dignity for weakness, they are only giving you the perfect opportunity to build an unbreakable empire of your own. Vivian taught us that the ultimate revenge is simply rising to a height where their toxicity can never touch you again. Have you ever had to outsmart a toxic family member or walk away from a shocking betrayal? Share your own triumph in the comments below, and do not forget to hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.